it won't be long, but most of these people will end up reading that book. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Nice job.
Hello, and thank you for coming out today. Am I speaking? Can everyone hear me okay? As Dr. Daly said, I am Laura Moriarty, and I'm going to go over a little bit about my trajectory, how I ended up here. It's really kind of neat for me to be talking about this book. This is my first book that I wrote 13, 14 years ago plus, because I started writing it a long time before I finished it. And I've been going around talking about my newest book, which came out in 2012, and so this is really strange to go back. I'm sure you had the experience of reading from something you wrote a long time ago, where you almost seem like a different person, but it's like an old friend, so it's kind of neat. But I was delighted when KU chose it for the KU Common Book. As Dr. Daly said, I got my undergraduate degree here in social work, and I never took a creative writing class, because I thought it was too indulgent, and I wanted to do something. I wanted to do something practical and helpful to the world. And so my plan was to get my undergraduate degree in social work and then go on to medical school. So I was taking pre-med courses and social work, and I was very nervous all the time about my GPA in physiology and biology. And then I got my degree in social work, which helped me in ways that I never planned on. My practicum year, the senior year, I was assigned to Duchesne Clinic in Kansas City, which is a clinic that serves underinsured, or at the time it served underinsured and homeless people in Kansas City, Kansas. It's right by Memorial Hall on Toroni. And it was run pretty much, it was organized by nuns who also had their masters of social work. And it was this great place where Kansas City physicians and nurses and physicians' assistants would volunteer their time and come down on a rotating basis to help people who otherwise wouldn't get medical care. So this was like in 1992, around then. And I was just a student, so it was my job, I kind of ran the clothing bank, I gave out bus tokens, and then I sat in a lot when the sisters who had masters in social work would interview clients or work with people who were coming in for help to sort of pick up on things and learn from their experience. And I did learn a lot. And one day, though, it was really, really hot. I remember it was a horribly hot day. It was 100 degrees. And a woman came in, and it was a school day, but she came in with her 5 young children, and they had walked. They'd walked a long, long way. And she was seeking some kind of assistance. And I believe it was Sister Dolores was asking them, was really kind of trying to ask the mother about the background of the kids and the paternity of the kids. She started to try to figure out, the father situation, because there were many of them. And the mother started to take offense because she, well, I don't know why, but maybe it was because it was a nun. Maybe it was because I was in the corner taking notes. There were all kinds of things that could have set her off. And so she stormed out with the 5 kids behind her, and there was nothing anyone could say to change her mind, and it was heartbreaking, and a good introduction to the fecklessness I think one feels in doing any kind of social work. You go in with good intentions, and then we never saw those kids again. And so I went home and I started thinking about the kids, and I thought about their perspective about what had happened that day, even as I never meant to villainize the mother, even in my own head. I was frustrated by her action, but most frustrated by the situation. And I went home and I started writing a story about one child's point of view. And I got rid of all the brothers and sisters because it was just too confusing, too complicated. I'd never really written any fiction. And so I just started writing about this trip to this center where they might get some kind of financial assistance or grocery assistance. And just wrote about the mother-daughter relationship and why the mother stormed out and how it looked to the little kid to go back out into the heat. And I found I just loved it. I loved being at the keyboard, and I felt so much more competent than I did as a social worker. I did my best in my years as social work. I went on to work with people with disabilities later and people with head injuries. But I never lost that feeling of fecklessness, and I don't know if that ever happens with social workers. I always felt like someone else should be sitting in the chair because that person would know what to say. But when I was writing, I all of a sudden felt like, oh, I kind of know what I'm doing here, this sort of natural sense of competency, and it was really exciting and intriguing. And I'm sure you've heard of that subject of flow, that idea that when you're working on something and you're so immersed in it. I just learned how to say the guy's name that came up with it. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? he's Czech. Anyway, he writes about this concept of flow, when you're so immersed in your work that you look down and, you know, the clock is doing this, you don't even notice because you're just in the zone. And I felt that, and I loved it so much, and much more than studying for the MCAT, which had kind of fallen out of the way by then. So I kept working on it, and then I finally worked up the nerve to sign up for a night class in creative writing. It was the first one I'd ever taken, and I was far behind the other students in the class because they were graduate students. Some of them were doctoral students. And they were very advanced and had studied it for a long time, and I was pretty much unschooled. I'd read a lot, but I'd kind of worked my way into this class. And I learned a lot really quickly, but it was a hard knock. I remember the first time I turned in this chapter for the Center of Everything, and it was this scene where you know, the mother and the daughter go in to get some kind of financial assistance, and the mom blows up and walks out. And there was a man in the creative writing workshop who was a doctoral student. He was very advanced, and his fiction was good and smooth, and I was just kind of in awe of him. And then I turned in my story, and I remember like sitting in this big circle in front of everyone he wrote. He said, "Laura, you're always so nice to me about my work. I wish I could find something." So I paid my dues quickly, but I said, "Could you be more specific?" And I went through and I tried to learn, and I did start to learn. And I am now still a big believer in creative writing classes. I think that if someone is a reader and maybe they have to have some kind of talent, you can school it, you can educate it, you can learn things about, oh, don't do that, or choose this kind of ending, don't choose that kind of ending, or try to think about this with language. And so I did learn. And I heard, but I never had time because I was still working as a social worker. So I was still working with people with disabilities. Now I moved on, I had graduated, and I was working full-time as a social worker with people with head injuries and then with people with disabilities. And as much as that work was gratifying, it was also very challenging, and I found that I loved my hobby far more than my work. And I felt that I was better at my hobby than I was at my work. And I heard about a contest in New Hampshire. Phillips Exeter Academy is a prep school you may or may not have heard of, and I had never heard of it because that was so outside my public school realm. But they had, even though it's a secondary school, they invited a writer in residence to come once a year. So they have this big contest every year, and anybody can apply for it. You just send in 50 pages of prose or poetry, and a committee picks it just based on the work. They don't look at schooling, they don't look at gender, they don't look at educational background. No, I just said that was schooling. What else don't they look at? Probably your criminal record, that's pretty much it. So, and then you just send it in, a committee of their English faculty decides who they want to bring in. And if you win, you go there, and you don't have to do anything but write. You just have to be the writer on campus, no classes, nothing. So I thought, oh, I'll just try for it. And I remember I mailed it from Dylan's, and I had my, my high hopes. And I remember talking to a family member about this and saying, oh, I'm kind of excited because I did this. And she said, it's a national contest. She said, don't get your hopes up, come on. Which is sort of more my family background, like don't try everything, so do this. But I got a letter back, and it said I didn't get it, but I got first runner-up. And I couldn't believe it. It was such a jolt of joy for me that these people who didn't know me, these people in New Hampshire, had picked mine, like I almost got it, and they wrote these nice things about the story and what I was trying to do, and these very encouraging words. And so that was it for me. I went back to grad school in creative writing. And I really started to learn because I was taking classes, I was having my stuff regularly workshopped, and then I was also teaching. They had me teach English 101 and English 102 to pay my way. But then I started to get to teach creative writing classes, and I found that that was really, I'm sure I don't have to tell you all that to teach is when you really learn, because you have to explain it to someone else, you have to articulate what sounds clunky, what sounds lovely, why. And I noticed my own work really improved. So after 3 years, I applied again for the same fellowship, and this time I got it. So I had a party, gave away everything I owned except for my dog, and we drove up to New Hampshire together. And I spent the year writing, and Exeter, New Hampshire is this tiny town, and there's now a train to Boston, but there wasn't when I was there. And there wasn't much to do, there was a lot of snow, and I just stayed in and wrote and wrote and wrote. And finished it by the end of the year, and and then I was able to sell it pretty quickly and publish it and work as a full-time writer. And so that was kind of a dream come true. It was a long road, it took all in all about 8 years, but So I don't know if you'd call it just an overnight success, but it was quite gratifying to see it come out and to hear people reading about it and talking about it. And so then eventually I came back to Lawrence when I thought, okay, now I can live anywhere I want because I'm self-employed. So I moved back to Lawrence because it's my favorite town. And then a job opened up at KU, coincidentally, and I went for it. So here I stand before you. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about what I was thinking about when I wrote the book. As I told you, it was based on this voice of this girl, with the mother who was sort of hot-headed, but maybe more complicated than one might think just from watching that scene. But when I got to Exeter, I remember I thought, okay, I want to give this some kind of historical context. I don't want them to be just free-floating in time. And I remembered one of my favorite novels, To Kill a Mockingbird, and how Harper Lee establishes time right away. She says, we had just been told that we had nothing to fear but fear itself. And so I thought, okay, presidents, and so I started thinking, well, what if I made her my age? What if she was 10 years old when Reagan came on the scene? And what would that mean? What would the Reagan era mean to a little girl on welfare? And so this is what I came up with. This is the first page, and I'll just read the first section to you. Ronald Reagan, she's 10 here. Ronald Reagan is on television, giving a speech because he wants to be president. He has the voice of a nice person and something in his hair that makes it shiny under the lights. I changed the channel, but it's still him, just from a different angle. The people in the audience wear cowboy hats with Reagan printed on the front, and they clap and blow horns every time he stops talking, so much that sometimes he has to put his hands up so they'll be quiet and hear what he has to say next. Nancy Reagan sits behind him, smiling and wearing a peach-colored dress with a bow on one of her shoulders, no cowboy hat. She claps too, but only after everyone else has started, so it looks like while he is talking, she is maybe thinking about something else. She's a mannequin, my mother says, pointing a spatula at the television. She freaks me out. My mother is maybe the opposite of Nancy Reagan. I could never imagine her wearing the peach dress with the bow on it, because she wears blue jeans and usually her gray sweatshirt. And she always listens to what everyone says, even people sitting in the next booth in restaurants who probably don't want her to listen. Right now, she's supposed to be in the kitchen, making us grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner, but she came out to the front room when she heard Ronald Reagan's voice, and now she's just standing there with the spatula, looking at the television and shaking her head until I can smell smoke coming from the kitchen, the bread starting to burn. She smells it too, runs back. Zing, she says. When she kisses me, sometimes she says smack. The people listening to Ronald Reagan in the audience yell, hip hip hooray, and wave their cowboy hats at the camera as it moves around the room. Finally, Ronald Reagan laughs and says, I think you're playing our song, and this just makes people yell more. My grandmother Eileen was here last week, and she said she remembered back when Ronald Reagan was an actor in movies. So handsome you'd faint if you ever got the chance to see him up close. She's worried about him being president, though, because his middle name is Wilson, which means he has 6 letters in each of his 3 names. And if you've read Revelations, that alone is enough to give you the shivers. But she's going to vote for him anyway, because she says he's the one person who can maybe make everything right again, and he's not afraid of the communists. Really, she says, the grand finale is coming one way or another, through him or through somebody else. The important thing is to be ready. My mother says not to listen to Eileen about things like this. 6 isn't just a number, she says. Bigger than 5, smaller than 7, and there are enough real reasons to worry about Ronald Reagan without bringing in imaginary ones. What's he saying now? What's he saying now, she yells. She's standing on top of a chair, waving a dish towel in front of the smoke detector. But I can't talk and listen at the same time, so I just listen, and Ronald Reagan says God put America between 2 oceans on purpose, to help the freedom fighters in Afghanistan and the Christians and Jews behind the Iron Curtain. I don't understand this, how a curtain can be iron. There was a metal fold-out wall between our classrooms last year at school. Usually it was shut, but when Mrs. West or Mrs. Blackmore was sick, the one who wasn't sick would unhook the latch and push it back so it folded up, and we would all just be in one big room together. No, my mother says, Iron Curtain is a figure of speech. There's not really a curtain anywhere. She brings the grilled cheese sandwiches out on a plate, burned on the edges but still okay to eat. One of her long red hairs in the melted cheese of mine. Sorry, she says, picking it out, I won't kill you. Ronald Reagan says he wants everyone to begin this crusade, joined together in a moment of silence. And really, he means praying to God. The people in cowboy hats take them off and bow their heads. but my mother keeps eating her sandwich. She doesn't like Ronald Reagan because she thinks he'll get us all blown up with nuclear bombs. She says all somebody has to do is get mad and push a button and we'll all be dead within half an hour, all the houses melted, the whales cooked in the seas. And Eileen can think she'll hear angels singing all she wants, but really she won't be able to hear a damn thing because she'll be just as dead as everybody else. She says she used to not worry so much about things like this, but now she has me, and the idea of somebody pushing this button makes her crazy, makes her scared when she hears even an airplane in the sky. I tell her if we had half an hour, we could go downstairs the way we do when the tornado sirens go off. We don't have our own basement, but there's a storage space underneath our apartment building, and my mother has a key. There would even be enough time to go outside and wave people down on the highway, tell them they better get inside. I would stay outside until I could see the missiles, and then I would run back and have my mother shut the door behind me. My mother says, no, Evelyn, it wouldn't work like that. A nuclear bomb would blow up the basement too. Just one bomb in Wichita or even Kansas City would be enough to get us, even all the way out here. If the bombs start going off, they'll get everyone, she says. It'll be curtains for us all. So that's the opening, and thank you. And so then I had the historical context, and to get that scene, Exeter did have an amazing library. They have a generous alumni association, to say the least, and they had this beautiful library with all these resources at my disposal, and they had lots of Reagan footage. And so I remember when I turned this in, my editor wrote, wouldn't Nancy be wearing red? But of course she hadn't come into red yet. This was pre-election, so she was still wearing peach. And it was strange to go back and watch these videos as an adult, because I remember watching him as a child and thinking he was really funny and charming, and the Jelly Bellies. And I came from a really conservative military family that really supported him and loved him. And when I got to KU, I know I came to this very building several times because of Latin American solidarity, and they had a slightly different take on it. So I was exposed to a different view, and certainly in social work, you're exposed to a different view. But when I got to Exeter, it was strange. So I got to Exeter in 2000, and I was kind of ready with my novel, but it was this unformed mess because I'd never had time to work on it. I'd always been, waitressing and teaching and taking classes, and so I had lots of material, but it wasn't anything, and I knew it needed to be streamlined. It was 600 pages when I turned it into my thesis, and I remember my thesis director was joking that we could sell this like a book in a bag or a book in 2 bags, and, it was too much. So I got up there, and I was really excited, and the very first week that I arrived at this little prep school in New Hampshire, where half the kids go to Harvard, and 47% go to Yale, and the 3% go to Sarah Lawrence, to be different, And it was a different world for me. And that first week they announced that there would be other visitors from Kansas, because Phillips Exeter Academy had just announced that they would have same-sex partners are okay to be dorm supervisors. And so the Phelps would be joining us. The week I got there, they were coming up, yay, hey you guys, great to see you again. And and at the same time, there was the evolution debate. It was really, really going on like crazy here. It was making national news. So, and I remember there was one student at Exeter who had come from Kansas, and we'd see each other in the cafeteria, and we'd raise our little Jayhawk mugs, but I remember sitting in the cafeteria with the faculty, and they would say things like, "What's it like to live there?" And this really strange view of my state. And it was interesting, and they would say things like, "I bet you're so glad to be out of there." And I wasn't really. I missed it. But it was strange to think, because often in Kansas I do feel alienated because of the politics, the general politics of the state. But when I got there and people were saying, kind of making fun of people, it was sort of like when you don't like someone in your family, and then you go outside your family and somebody makes fun of your family member and you're like, you don't know what you're talking about. Right. I felt that way a little bit, like defensive of it. And so I created this character of Eileen, and she is Evelyn's fundamentalist grandmother, the one who worries about the 666 letters in Reagan's name. But I wanted to make her a full-fledged character, a person who is deep and thoughtful in her own way. And really, they're battling for Evelyn's heart, because the mother is secular and in her own way very intelligent, but she is kind of a mess. Whereas the grandmother offers real stability and consistent love. And when the mother's choices start to really harm and leave Evelyn with so much instability in her life. Basically, the mom has an affair with a married man, gets pregnant, he leaves, and the baby has profound disabilities. And so this really affects this kid's life. Like, they were already on the borderline poverty, but now things are super shaky. She embraces and is embraced by her grandmother's fundamentalist church, which provides so much security, so much stability, and so many answers. But the problem is, and really the tension in the book is, I think Evelyn is a budding scientist. She has a very rational, inquisitive mind, and so it's really a battle between her natural sense of what is rational, true, and eventually compassionate, and the security that her grandmother's worldview has always offered her. Wow. And I'm just going to read a little section. Okay. So this is later. This is after the little brother has been born, and she's spending a lot of time with her grandmother and her grandmother's church. And let's see, I'll start here. All right. Okay, so she's at the fundamentalist church right now, and it's actually set in a church that I remembered from my adolescence in Montana, which it was sort of a grassroots church, and so because it was so extremely fundamentalist. And so it took place in a roller skating rink during the daytime. They would rent it out. And so it was strange. I remember we'd all have chairs out on the floor and the disco ball would be rotating. So that's what I used. The disco ball turns slowly, reflecting circles of sunlight around the room. Pastor Dave looks up at it, then out the window. What are we going to do about America today? Read the paper and you might be able to confuse this once great God-fearing nation with Sodom and Gomorrah. Eileen makes a clicking sound with her tongue and nods. Well, let me tell you something. If you all think fire and brimstone was bad, that's nothing compared to what's coming. When God comes down from the heavens to separate the faithful from the sinners once and for all. Hallelujah, someone says. Praise be. Pastor Dave closes his eyes and raises his baby blue arms above his head. But the righteous should have no fear, he says, the words rolling out of his mouth. For the good Lord knows that the names are written in the book of the followers, and they shall be flown on the wings of angels into everlasting peace, while all the rest will be damned by this terrible swift sword to everlasting contempt. When Pastor Dave gets to this last part, he clasps his hands together and swings his arms quickly, the way you would swing a bat, or maybe a swift sword as well. I try to think about what it would really look like. All those angels coming down, God swinging a sword from over his shoulder, cutting his heads off all the homosexuals and Russians, Jesus standing behind him with his hands over his eyes. My name's in the book, I would yell, and God, still cutting off other people's heads, would smile down at me and say, I know, Evelyn, I know. Pastor Dave